Greetings and salutations, friends. I'm Dylan.
This is Bryce.
Today we're going to be continuing our series on heresiology with Gnosticism, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get it started.
So we're going to start with our traditional multiple choice, and here we go. Gnosticism was A populist Christian heresy in the 4th century that rejected the authority of the Bible. B, a movement originating in Rome that taught God can be most purely experienced in nature. C, not significant until it was popularized by Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Or D, a family of early heresies driven by the pursuit of secret spiritual knowledge and a strong emphasis on a dualist worldview. Take a second, reason, figure it out, Google it real quick. And if you did Google it, you would find that the answer is D, a family of early heresies driven by the pursuit of secret spiritual knowledge and a strong emphasis on a dualist worldview.
So let's get into what Gnosticism is and more of the bones of it. What Gnosticism suggests or asserts is that God is an entirely spiritual being that is utterly beyond human comprehension. It asserts that God did not create the material world, but was created by a lesser being, a lesser God of sorts. And because of this, the physical world is inherently inferior to the spiritual world. Gnostics believed that they were set apart by special knowledge regarding the spiritual world gained through spiritual experiences and through Christ, and that the realization of the divine nature would be the way that they were saved. Continuing into this, the Gnostics believed that human souls are tiny sparks of divinity, much like the way that Hindus familiarize their human nature, I guess, if you're familiar with that. But they believe that human souls are tiny sparks of divinity that have burst off of the divine God, and they've been separated from God and trapped into the physical universe, which the lesser God created. The Christian fall, Adam and Eve's sin, isn't necessarily what the Bible proclaims, but it's the trapping of these divine sparks within the physical universe. Now, I mentioned in the last slide that the secret knowledge that the Gnostics claimed was from Jesus, and they viewed Jesus as a less divine being, still divine, but less divine than God, but still more divine than humanity, and his purpose was that he was sent to awaken us back to our divine nature and to show us, our little spark selves, the way back to the spiritual realm, which was, of course, a form of Gnosticism, which we've covered in a previous video, and I'll go ahead and slap a link to that on this slide right now. The journey from this physical universe to the spiritual realm is a process of salvation, and if you're familiar with what Christian orthodoxy has always taught that salvation isn't a salvation from the physical universe, it's a salvation of the physical universe, because God created it, and God created good.
So hang on. Even though Gnosticism isn't really complicated, it's very foreign to our way of thinking. So let's take a moment and break it down just a little bit more. Gnosticism holds that there is a great divine being that is the source of all spiritual and true existence. And from this divine being, lesser divine, quote-unquote divine beings, shoot off. And one of these beings, a good example of a being like this would be the God of the Bible. In turn, even lesser spiritual beings shoot off from those beings, and this process can continue indefinitely. Eventually, we get to the point where human souls, which are very small, quote-unquote droplets of divinity, shoot off from one of those sort of blobs of the divine, and they become trapped in the physical world. That physical world artificially obstructs their knowledge of and association with the ultimate spiritual reality. And so they are divorced from this source of all divinity and spiritual existence. Now, their salvation would be to return to that source of spiritual existence and that great spiritual reality. But to do that, they have to overcome the entrapment of the physical world.
Even though these Gnostic ideas of a divine shattering and sparks seems very odd to us in our worldview, It's quite clear that Gnostic ideas were not very odd at all in the first century, because even as early as the apostles in the writings of the Bible, we see them addressing Gnostic ideas that have begun to take root, and they're addressing them in condemnation and preaching against them. Several biblical passages seem to be specifically aimed against Gnostic tendencies, one of which is 1 John's emphasis on Jesus coming in the flesh. A second one would be 1 Timothy chapter 6 specifically. But in 1 Timothy, Paul sets out to accomplish two goals, the first of which is to denounce false teaching and refute it, and the second is to teach godliness and to prescribe godly training. After Paul accomplishes these goals, when he's giving his final charges to Timothy, in the last two verses of the chapter, Paul specifically cites those who falsely claim knowledge and have thus abandoned the faith. A third one of these passages, and of course there's more than just these three, we've only chosen to display three here for time's sake, but a third one is John chapter 1, which emphasizes the Word, who is God, becoming flesh, which is a wed of the divine and the material, which of course we kind of covered this in our video on Gnosticism as well. But this is also a refutation of the Gnostic tendencies of seeing material as very much less than divine. There is also one other point where Gnosticism and Christianity conflict, which is the account of the physical world. Of course, Genesis 1 wasn't written specifically to denounce Gnosticism, but since the Gnostics teach that the material realm is bad, and Genesis 1, the very first chapter in the Bible, teaches that the material world is good and a good creation of God, we see that this conflict isn't something that's been born out of Christianity. It's something that's working against Christianity.
Despite the pretty clear condemnations of Gnostic tendencies in the New Testament in the first century, Gnosticism actually persisted alongside Orthodox Christianity for the first several centuries of the Christian faith. Many of our early Christian leaders continue to respond very strongly to Gnostic ideas, and they do this in the same way the New Testament does, by pointing to the incarnation as at the very heart of the gospel and at the very heart of Christianity. So once again, it's not so much attacking the entire Gnostic worldview as attacking that one point of Gnosticism that Gnosticism has to hold, because it holds that the material world is bad and is evil and less than the spiritual world. Of note, we have Ignatius of Antioch, who, as well as appealing to the incarnation, he also appealed to local church authority and that idea of apostolic succession, where the apostles passed on their teachings to later Christian leaders, and those later Christian leaders continued to pass on those teachings. And so the teachings of the apostles, and through them the teachings of Jesus himself, remained organically connected to the church. Ignatius of Antioch appeals to that idea and pointing to local church authority that rejected Gnosticism as a reason that Gnosticism is incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. Another church leader in early church history called Hippolytus clearly showed that Gnosticism has its roots in Greek philosophy, which we kind of went through. The idea of the divine breaking off is very closely linked to Platonic philosophy and the idea of forms. If you guys have studied philosophy much at all, you'll be familiar with that concept. Finally, we have Tertullian, who argued that because Gnostics can't even agree among themselves on a lot of different subjects, they lack credibility. For example, Gnostics would differ in how many degrees of separation Jesus would have had from the ultimate divine being and the source of all spiritual being that they held was the great God. A final church leader who is really important in terms of refuting Gnosticism is Irenaeus. He was a bishop in the city of Lyon, and he argued at length against Gnosticism in his Magnus Opum against heresies. In this, he describes several schools, I believe the number's around 20, of different systems of Gnostic thought. And he critiques them on several grounds, the first being that their entire systems are built on unsupported premises. So where Christianity can look back and see the tradition of the God of the Bible and all the way back in Jewish history, and even at that point back to 4,000 years worth of tradition, Gnostics could just point to what they kind of come up with out of their own head. He also contended that Gnostic use of Scripture ignores both literary context and traditional interpretation. We've talked a little bit about traditional interpretation as we talked about the idea of apostolic succession. But in terms of literary context, a good example would be in the Psalms where, and Jesus quotes this, it says, "You are gods." The Gnostics could conceivably take that and apply it to their idea of humanity as a droplet of divinity. However, to do so would ignore the context of the psalm, which pretty clearly shows that these gods are beings that are quite separate from the God of the Jewish people that's being referenced in the psalm. If you guys aren't really grasping that, go ahead and go back and read Psalm 82, and it'll be very clear. It's just like 6-7 verses. Irenaeus also very, very strongly asserts the goodness of the physical universe as the handiwork of God. It's even been said that Irenaeus was a man who loved dirt. So great was his affinity for just all things physical and his belief that those things were good and were gifts of God.
So what does this have to do with today, right? I mean, this heresy's been stamped out. We don't have any modern Gnostic churches, or there's no denominational offshoots of Gnosticism, right? Well, yes and no. And I'll provide two examples of some very Gnostic things, and one that's got some root in Gnosticism but isn't really Gnostic. The first one of these is, have you ever heard the notion of when I die I'm going to go to heaven? And then, if while I'm in heaven I'll just kind of sit there as a disembodied soul playing a harp and praising God, and it'll be kind of cool, right? Well, that's not at all what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches in a recreation of the physical world. It teaches in a physical resurrection, just as Jesus was physically resurrected. And it teaches that the material is very important to God. So this notion of when we die, our bodies are just going to kind of rot in the ground, and we're going to be spirits in heaven singing, and it's going to be great. Well, it will be great when we're spending time with God physically, but that's not the Bible's teaching. That's a very Gnostic thing that's come about and reared its ugly head in today's church. Another one would be any type of escapist theology that seems to promote an idea of sort of passive dealings with the world until God comes to redeem us and take us out of the world and pull us away from all these bad things that are in the world. This has more Christian backing because God will certainly be redeeming us from these evil things. But the idea isn't that we're escaping from it as far as the Bible's concerned. The idea is that we're called to participate in the change and the redemption of these physical things. So both of these have sort of Gnostic tendencies, one much more than the other. But Gnosticism is still alive in our churches today. So there's two things that we want you to take away from this video, and two things that we have taken away from writing this video. The first is that we must remember as Christians that Christianity holds that the physical world is good. We hold that the physical world is good based on God's act of creation and based on God's act in the incarnation. The Word was God and became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen these things. We also must hold that redemption has both physical and spiritual components. Redemption isn't simply just that we'll be taken away or spirited away, that we'll get to go to a heavenly realm. But redemption is that the very earth, which groans alongside of us, will be remade, and it will be good and restored to what it was meant to be before the fall. The second thing to take away from this is that we must take care that the insights into Scripture gained by individuals or local groups remain submitted to the understanding of the church as a whole throughout history. There's no better example of this in modernity, in modern Christian thought, than the idea of that we'll just be in heaven playing harps. This is not a biblical idea whatsoever, but some have taken interpretations of Scripture to assert that we'll just be doing this. And so we need to submit this under the authority of the church and under the understanding of people who have devoted their lives to making sure that we're able to understand the Scripture so that we are able to deal with our faith in a respectful and intelligible way that doesn't demean it or define it. In any sense, this is going to go ahead and end this video for today, as there's nothing more that we have to talk about. We've, of course, appreciated having this conversation with you. We appreciate that you've been here to listen to it. If you guys have any questions or comments, please take the time to leave them in the comments section below, and we'll do our best to respond to them, as well as if you have any topical things that you'd like us to cover. We're getting close to the end of this series. Go ahead and leave those for us as well, and we'll see what we can do to get around to them. Of course, as is customary in our videos, I'd like to just remind us that the Bible does tell us that we will be known as disciples of Christ by our love for one another, and as Bryce has so eloquently mentioned in previous videos, we understand that these videos are going to be seen by those who don't share our beliefs, and we just ask that everyone maintain an air of civility and kindness toward one another as we talk about these things. Because we've tried to show throughout these videos that a lot of what we hold today, while it isn't wrong, it isn't what we've always held to in Christianity, and there is room for dialogue. So we expect dialogue, we encourage dialogue, and we just ask that you guys will be very kind to one another. That's going to do it for this video. We'll see you next time. I'm Dylan.
This is Bryce.
Farewell.